January 6, 1944, at the headquarters of the U.S. 8th Air Force in High Wycombe, England, Major General Jimmy Doolittle paid a visit to Major General William Kepner, head of VI Fighter Command. While standing in Kepner's office, Doolittle noticed a placard displayed above the desk. Its message was straightforward. The primary responsibility of 8th Air Force fighters was to ensure the bombers returned safely. Doolittle studied the words, then calmly stated that the sign should be removed. In his view, it reflected a flawed priority. Before the day ended, a replacement appeared. The new directive declared that the foremost task of 8th Air Force fighters was to destroy German fighter aircraft. That change signaled a dramatic shift in American air strategy. Within weeks, the new approach would help dismantle the Luftwaffe's ability to contest the skies over Europe. What many bomber crews initially regarded as reckless and some senior officers considered dangerously aggressive would prove decisive in securing air superiority ahead of the Allied invasion of Western Europe. The turning point would not come solely from improved technology, but from a fundamental rethinking of how fighter escorts should be used. The urgency behind this decision had been building for months. On October 14, 1943, 291 American B-17 Flying Fortresses launched a second deep penetration raid against the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, a critical hub for German industrial production. The bombers struck their targets with precision. The losses, however, were staggering. B-17 Memphis Belle, one of the rare crews to complete its tour, recorded his frustration after the Schweinfurt raid. He wrote that bomber crews were being cut down while escort fighters turned back at the German frontier, leaving them to continue alone into heavily defended airspace. Despite the defensive firepower of the B-17 formations, it was not enough without continuous fighter cover. German interceptors had refined highly effective tactics. They assembled beyond the reach of Allied escorts, then attacked in concentrated waves. Head-on assaults through bomber formations, often at combined speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour, left American gunners only seconds to respond. Some German fighters carried 30mm cannon and air-to-air rockets capable of destroying a B-17 with a single strike. The core problem was range. American escort fighters such as the P-38 Lightning and the P-47 Thunderbolt could not accompany bombers to the deepest targets inside Germany. During the Schweinfurt mission, they had turned back hundreds of miles short of the objective, leaving the bombers exposed to sustained attack. In December 1943, General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding the United States Army Air Forces, made the stakes explicit. Unless the German air arm was neutralized, Operation Overlord, the planned invasion of Normandy, could not proceed. Losses on daylight bombing missions were unsustainable. A solution had to be found. That solution emerged in late 1943 with the arrival of the North American P-51 Mustang, equipped with a Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine capable of producing nearly 1,700 horsepower under war emergency conditions. The aircraft could operate effectively above 40,000 feet, an altitude that challenged many German designs. Pilots quickly recognized its superiority. Reports from units such as the 357th Fighter Group emphasized that the Mustang outperformed contemporary German fighters in speed, climb, and maneuverability. For the first time, American escorts could travel the full distance with bomber formations and engage the enemy on equal or better terms. Yet range alone would not determine the outcome. The method of employing these fighters was equally critical. Under earlier doctrine, escort aircraft remained tightly grouped around bomber streams, never straying far from the formations they were assigned to protect. When German fighters attacked, escorts would respond, but their primary obligation was to remain close and resume defensive positioning as quickly as possible. This approach placed the initiative in German hands. Enemy pilots selected when and where to strike, diving through bomber formations at high speed, inflicting damage, and withdrawing before escorts could mount a sustained counterattack. American fighters were reacting rather than dictating the battle. Major General Ira Eaker, Doolittle's predecessor, had formalized this defensive philosophy. A career bomber officer, Eaker believed strongly in the self-defending capacity of heavy bomber formations with their overlapping fields of machine gun fire. In his view, fighters existed to reinforce that shield, not to abandon it in pursuit of offensive engagements. Doolittle brought a different perspective. Unlike many senior air leaders, he was not rooted in bomber operations. His generation grasped the mechanics of air power as deeply as he did. He not only mastered the technical limits of aircraft, but also the fluid, fast-changing logic of aerial combat. The operation that turned him into a national figure, the April 18, 1942 attack on Tokyo, had demonstrated that rare combination of boldness and precision. 16 B-25 bombers lifted off from the carrier USS Hornet, a feat many experts had considered nearly impossible. The strike was daring in conception, complex in execution, and strategically powerful in its psychological impact. For personally leading that mission, he was awarded the Medal of Honor. By early 1944, he had been assigned a different challenge. Placed in command of the 8th Air Force, he was instructed by General Henry Hap Arnold to address a critical weakness, the vulnerability of American bombers to German fighters. On January 6, 1944, his first full day in command, he met with senior staff and announced a dramatic change in policy. Escort fighters would no longer cling tightly to bomber formations. Instead, they would move ahead of them, sometimes 50 miles in front and 25 miles to either side, actively searching for enemy aircraft before they could organize an attack. The new approach did not end there. Once the bombers released their payloads and turned back toward England, escort fighters would not simply accompany them home. They would continue sweeping missions over German territory at low altitude, attacking airfields, destroying aircraft parked on the ground, and striking rail lines and fuel installations. The objective was no longer limited to shielding bombers in flight. It was the systematic dismantling of the German fighter force. The announcement unsettled many. Colonel Don Blakesley of the 4th Fighter Group saw the change as overdue, telling his men they were finally free to pursue the enemy on their own terms. Bomber crews reacted differently. To them, the close presence of escorts had often meant survival. The thought of watching their protective cover vanish into the distance felt like abandonment. Lieutenant Colonel James Howard of the 354th Fighter Group later observed that many bomber crews believed the new doctrine bordered on recklessness. They struggled to accept the idea that preventing attacks by eliminating German fighters before contact offered greater protection than waiting to fight them off in the middle of a formation. Their anxiety was understandable. Without escorts nearby, the bombers appeared exposed and alone. Whether this strategic gamble would succeed depended on the German response. During the winter of 1943-44, leaders of the Luftwaffe believed they were gaining the upper hand. Despite sustained Allied bombing, German industry had expanded fighter production. Factories producing Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf Fw-190s were delivering more than 1,000 aircraft per month. Specialized Fw-190 Sturm variants, fitted with heavy underwing cannon, could tear through bomber formations in a single pass. These heavily armed interceptors were typically shielded by faster Bf-109s, tasked with engaging American escorts and keeping them occupied. General Adolf Garland, commander of German fighter forces, concluded that the attrition battle favored Germany. In late 1943, he informed Hermann Goering that American losses in daylight raids were approaching unsustainable levels. Nearly 3,000 Luftwaffe fighter pilots were killed, wounded, or listed as missing. To compensate, training programs were shortened from roughly 250 flight hours to about 150. New pilots reached operational units with minimal preparation, barely sufficient to handle their machines, much less to duel seasoned Allied airmen. Letters from the front revealed the strain. One Bf-109 pilot, already credited with several victories, described how replacements survived only a handful of missions. Many lacked confidence in aerial maneuvers, struggled to coordinate with wingmen, and often froze under pressure. Veterans found themselves fighting the enemy while simultaneously shielding inexperienced comrades. The imbalance was becoming severe. The coming months would show whether the new American offensive doctrine, hunting fighters before they could strike, would exploit that growing weakness in Germany's air arm. Severe winter weather across Europe postponed the first large-scale use of General James Doolittle's revised fighter doctrine in early 1944. For days at a time, snow, cloud cover, and heavy winds kept American bomber fleets grounded. The opportunity finally arrived on January 29, when more than 800 U.S. bombers set course for Frankfurt. That mission marked the operational debut of a new approach to air escort. High above the bomber stream, at roughly 28,000 feet, P-51 Mustangs from the 357th Fighter Group advanced ahead of the formation. Instead of remaining tightly attached to specific bomber elements, they flew in wider, more flexible groupings designed to increase visibility and reaction speed. Their orders were simple but revolutionary: seek out and engage German fighters before those fighters could organize attacks on the bombers. The German formation, expecting time to prepare its assault, suddenly found itself under attack by opponents holding both speed and height advantages. The clash lasted only minutes, 8 by most accounts. 13 German aircraft were shot down. 2 Mustangs were hit but managed to return safely. The surviving German fighters dispersed and never reached the bombers. Elsewhere that day, Captain Don Blakesley of the 4th Fighter Group reported similar results near Cologne. His pilots caught approximately 20 Focke-Wulf Fw-190s assembling for a climb toward the bomber stream. Laden with fuel and ammunition, the German aircraft were sluggish. The American fighters struck with surprise and momentum, destroying 11 before the rest could disengage. For bomber crews en route to Frankfurt, the difference was striking. The sustained massed fighter assaults that had characterized earlier missions were largely absent. The decisive trial of these tactics came weeks later during Operation Argument. Soon called Big Week, General Carl Spaatz, commander of U.S. Strategic Air Forces in Europe, crafted the plan as a calculated provocation. American bombers would target key German aircraft manufacturing centers, objectives so vital that the Luftwaffe would be compelled to defend them at all costs. Damaging factories was important, but the deeper aim was to draw German fighters into a prolonged battle of attrition against an American escort force that now possessed numerical strength and growing qualitative superiority. On February 20, 1944, clear skies finally opened over Germany. The Luftwaffe responded in force. Roughly 900 German fighters took to the air. Over central Germany, condensation trails webbed the sky from low altitude to nearly 40,000 feet as thousands of aircraft converged. This time, however, American fighters were not confined to close defensive patterns. They swept widely across German airspace, attacking enemy formations as they assembled, as they climbed, and even as they prepared to land. The escort mission had evolved into aggressive air dominance. Lieutenant Urban Drew of the 361st Fighter Group encountered a group of Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighters near Leipzig as they were taking off. In level flight, the new jets were formidable, but during takeoff they were exposed. Diving from high altitude despite anti-aircraft fire, Drew fired on the lead aircraft as it left the runway, destroying it. A second jet was shot down before it could accelerate, the remainder scattered. His report later emphasized a practical truth: even advanced aircraft are vulnerable during takeoff and landing. The opening day of Big Week cost the United States 21 heavy bombers and 4 fighters. Losses that would have seemed modest compared to the devastating Schweinfurt raid 3 months earlier. German losses, however, were severe. More than 50 fighters destroyed and 38 pilots killed or gravely wounded. Over the following 5 days, weather permitting, attacks continued against Regensburg, Brunswick, Schweinfurt again, Gotha, and Augsburg. Each mission compelled a German response. Each engagement drained experienced pilots and scarce aircraft. American forces had lost 226 heavy bombers and 28 escort fighters, with approximately 2,600 casualties, serious but sustainable given U.S. industrial output and training capacity. German losses exceeded 350 fighters destroyed, and roughly 90 more written off. Most damaging of all was the loss of nearly 100 pilots killed and more than 50 severely wounded, men who averaged years of combat experience and could not be rapidly replaced. Big Week did not end the air war over Europe, but it marked a turning point. The Luftwaffe had been drawn into the kind of battle it could no longer afford, and it emerged irreparably weakened. By early 1944, senior German officers were already acknowledging a crisis in the fighter arm. Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Ellerfeld, commanding a Jagdgeschwader wing, warned General Adolf Galland that experienced airmen were disappearing faster than they could be replaced. New arrivals, he wrote, stood little chance against American fighters. Within a matter of months, Germany might still possess aircraft, but not the trained men required to fight them. The shift in American strategy under General Jimmy Doolittle deepened that crisis. Escort fighters were no longer confined to close protection of bomber formations. After guiding heavy bombers to their targets, American pilots descended to low altitude and attacked airfields, rail lines, fuel depots, and transport columns. German bases became routine targets. Aircraft parked in the open, machines undergoing repair, maintenance crews, fuel convoys, and hangars were all vulnerable. German fighter pilots returning from combat increasingly found their own airfields under attack. On the ground, mechanics servicing aircraft were cut down, fuel trucks erupted in flames. Sustained operations under such constant pressure became nearly impossible. The cumulative strain became unmistakable in March 1944 when the U.S. 8th Air Force mounted its first major assault on Berlin. On March 6, approximately 730 bombers, protected by some 800 fighters, struck the German capital. Because of Berlin's symbolic and strategic value, the Luftwaffe committed everything available. More than 150 German fighters engaged the incoming formations in a vast running battle that stretched across hundreds of miles. The outcome was catastrophic for Germany. American losses totaled 69 bombers and 11 fighters. German losses reached 160 aircraft destroyed and another 50 damaged. Even more devastating was the human cost. Nearly 70 experienced fighter pilots killed or wounded in a single day. For a force already stretched thin, this was irreparable damage. Captain Johannes Wies, commanding a group within Jagdgeschwader 52 and a veteran of the battle, later wrote that he had witnessed the effective collapse of Germany's fighter arm. The Luftwaffe had committed its best and still failed. American losses, he observed, could be replaced. Germany's could not. Between January and May 1944, the attrition became unsustainable. More than 1,000 German fighter pilots were killed, wounded, or went missing, roughly 1/4 of the available force at the beginning of the year. The losses fell disproportionately on veterans, squadron leaders, instructors, and highly decorated aces. 28 pilots with more than 30 victories were lost in those months. 8 with over 100 victories were killed or captured. By mid-year, total flight training averaged about 110 hours, and in some cases fell to only 50. American pilots during the same period typically logged more than 450 hours, including extensive time in their operational aircraft. Major Hans Philipp, an ace credited with 206 victories, described the consequences shortly before his death in October 1943. New pilots arrived unable to maintain formation discipline, unfamiliar with tactical doctrine, and prone to panic under fire. Against seasoned American aviators flying increasingly capable aircraft, many survived only a handful of missions. Industrial production widened the gap. In the first half of 1944, American factories produced more than 22,000 fighter aircraft. German output, despite dispersal efforts intended to reduce vulnerability to bombing, reached roughly 9,000 fighters. Numerical superiority alone would have been formidable. Combined with qualitative advantages, it proved decisive. The North American P-51 Mustang outperformed the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf FW-190 in most combat environments. It offered greater range, strong high-altitude performance, competitive maneuverability, and superior speed. American formations also benefited from reliable fuel supplies, abundant ammunition, and increasingly refined tactics. Colonel Hubert Zemke, commanding the 56th Fighter Group equipped with P-47 Thunderbolts, summarized the imbalance. The United States possessed superior numbers, training, logistics, and aircraft. German pilots displayed determination, but bravery could not compensate for systemic shortages and declining readiness. Underfueled, poorly supplied aircraft with minimal maintenance support. Meanwhile, American formations grew larger and more confident with each mission. On May 8, 1944, The 8th Air Force dispatched nearly 900 bombers against oil facilities and rail centers in Germany, escorted by more than 750 fighters. No German interceptors challenged them. For the first time, the Luftwaffe effectively ceded control of the skies. Adolf Galland reported to Hermann Goering that the fighter force was functionally destroyed. Aircraft existed on paper, but fuel shortages grounded many of them, and surviving pilots lacked the training and experience to mount effective resistance. The strategic consequences became fully apparent on June 6, 1944, D-Day. Allied air forces flew over 14,000 sorties during the opening phase of the Normandy invasion. German fighter units managed fewer than 300. This imbalance enabled Allied fighter bombers to strike troop movements and supply lines with near impunity, while heavy bombers isolated the battlefield. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding German forces in France, acknowledged in a private message that without air cover, daylight movement was nearly impossible and reinforcement of the beaches increasingly untenable. The transformation from October 1943 to June 1944 was dramatic. Only months earlier, the Luftwaffe had appeared capable of imposing prohibitive losses on American bomber forces. By mid-1944, it had largely ceased to function as an effective air defense over Western Europe. Statistics underscore the scale of destruction. Between January and June 1944, more than 2,500 German fighter pilots were killed or seriously wounded, approximately three-quarters of the available force at the start of that period. American losses included around 420 fighter pilots killed or missing and roughly 7,000 bomber crew casualties. Combat ratios shifted accordingly. In October 1943, German fighters had destroyed American bombers at roughly 20-1 against fighter losses. By May 1944, American fighters were downing German aircraft at approximately 4-1. Beyond numbers, morale reversed. German pilots who began 1944 expecting victory increasingly flew with the expectation of not returning. American airmen, once wary of German skill and aggression, now sought combat with growing confidence. The air war over Europe had reached a decisive turning point. At the beginning of 1944, Allied airmen felt relief when German fighters failed to appear in strength. Only weeks later, that relief turned into impatience as enemy aircraft became scarce. By spring, frustration replaced anxiety. There were fewer and fewer German planes left to engage. In just a few months, the emotional climate in the American Air Forces had completely reversed. This shift stemmed from a controversial decision made by Jimmy Doolittle. When he authorized American escort fighters to roam far ahead of bomber formations and actively seek combat, many bomber commanders objected. They believed pulling fighters away from tight defensive coverage exposed bombers to unacceptable danger. Yet the gamble preserved and ultimately strengthened the entire strategic bombing effort. Instead of reacting to German attacks, Allied fighters began destroying enemy aircraft before they could assemble. Offensive sweeps over airfields and known gathering points proved far more effective than hovering beside bomber formations. Later conceded his mistake. Preventing attacks at their source was more efficient than trying to break them up mid-air. Doolittle grasped this principle earlier than most. His directive in January redefined the role of escort aviation. Before that moment, fighters were considered an extension of bomber self-defense. After the intense air battles of early 1944, often associated with Big Week, fighters became the primary instrument for gaining dominance in the sky, while bombers increasingly drew enemy aircraft into battle. The implications extended far beyond Europe. These strategic lessons shaped U.S. doctrine in later conflicts, including the Korean War and the Vietnam War. The central insight endured: control of the air depends on destroying hostile air power proactively, not merely shielding friendly forces. Victory, however, carried a severe price. During the first half of 1944, more than 10,000 American airmen were killed over Europe. Bomber crews climbed into their aircraft day after day, aware that survival was never guaranteed. Fighter pilots pushed deep into enemy territory, accepting extreme risk in order to thin German ranks. Among them was Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group, who survived the war with 27 victories, becoming one of America's leading aces in Europe. Years later, he reflected that statistics obscure the human reality. Thousands of young men launched into combat daily, knowing many would not return. Success came from a combination of courage, training, superior aircraft, evolving tactics, and decisive leadership. By late summer 1944, the German fighter arm, known as the Luftwaffe fighter force, had effectively lost its coherence as a defensive system. Yet aircraft production could not compensate for the loss of experienced pilots, shortages of fuel, or the absence of seasoned leadership needed to train replacements and refine tactics. German ace Erich Rudolph, credited with over 220 victories, later summarized the dilemma. By the time production surged, qualified pilots were scarce. The Allied offensive in the spring had removed much of the veteran corps. Numbers alone could not restore balance. Doolittle's strategy established a lasting model for modern air warfare. Superiority in the air demands initiative, technological competence, and, above all, well-trained personnel. Numerical advantage becomes decisive only when paired with qualitative strength. Most critically, transformative leadership willing to challenge entrenched doctrine can yield results that incremental adjustments never achieve. Initially, many bomber crews feared they had been abandoned. Over time, they recognized that distance meant protection. As journalist Andy Rooney, who flew on bombing missions for Stars and Stripes, observed in mid-1944, the escorts saved the bombers by ranging far ahead. When fighters remained close, German aircraft still found opportunities to attack. When escorts aggressively cleared the skies in advance, the enemy struggled to reach the bombers at all. Offensive action became the truest form of defense. By the time Allied forces launched the invasion of Normandy, air supremacy over Western Europe was complete. German aircraft still operated, but in insufficient strength to meaningfully disrupt Allied operations. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower later emphasized that freedom from enemy air interference was essential to the invasion's success. Capacity to strike before it can act. In the winter of 1943–44, the air war over Europe stood at a breaking point. During the autumn of 1943, the German air arm, the Luftwaffe, appeared to be gaining the upper hand in the struggle over the Reich. American heavy bombers were being shot down at a rate that could not be sustained. The long-range strategic bombing effort against Germany seemed close to failure. Then, within half a year, the situation reversed with stunning speed. The shift began after Lieutenant General James Doolittle assumed command of the U.S. 8th Air Force and altered the role of American fighter escorts in January 1944. Instead of remaining tightly bound to bomber formations in a defensive screen, fighters were granted freedom to range ahead, seek out German interceptors, and destroy them wherever they could be found. The objective was no longer simply to shield bombers, it was to eliminate the enemy's fighter force altogether. The results were decisive. By June 1944, as Allied forces prepared for the invasion of France, American bombers were operating with far lighter losses, protected not by proximity alone, but by the growing absence of German opposition. The transformation was so abrupt that German commanders struggled to explain it. In his post-war writings, General Adolf Galland pinpointed the moment clearly. Once American fighters were unleashed to hunt independently, the air war was effectively lost. German units could challenge bombers or fighters, but not both at once. Statistics from 1944 underscore the scale of the collapse. American losses were substantial, but strategically manageable. Roughly 750 U.S. fighter pilots were killed in the same period, and bomber corps suffered approximately 16,000 casualties. Yet American industry and training capacity dwarfed Germany's shrinking resources. U.S. flight schools graduated more than 35,000 new pilots in 1944, and factories produced over 63,000 military aircraft. Combat effectiveness shifted accordingly. Whereas German fighters had achieved a modest edge in 1943, by 1944, American pilots were downing enemy aircraft at a ratio of nearly 4-to-1. By the final year of the war, that margin widened even further. Perhaps the clearest indicator of decline was experience. In early 1944, the average German fighter pilot possessed extensive combat hours, often over 200. 1 year later, replacements commonly entered battle with fewer than 50. Germany had not entirely exhausted its aircraft or fuel supplies, though both were strained. What it lacked was seasoned aviators capable of surviving sustained air combat. Doolittle's directive accomplished precisely what senior American leadership demanded: the neutralization of the German fighter arm before the cross-channel invasion. By systematically attacking the enemy's aerial strength, the Allies secured the air superiority necessary for operations over occupied Europe and during the Normandy landings. The campaign demonstrated that dominance in the air depends on destroying hostile aircraft, not merely escorting friendly ones. The human cost was severe. More than 26,000 American airmen died in the European theater during the war, and the 8th Air Force alone suffered tens of thousands of casualties. Leaders were killed or captured in large numbers. Few survived the sustained attrition of 1944. Major Erich Hartmann, the highest-scoring fighter ace of the war with 352 victories, avoided this fate largely because he fought primarily on the Eastern Front. Reflecting later, he acknowledged that in the West, the German fighter force had been decisively broken by superior numbers, training, aircraft, and tactics. At the time the new policy was announced, critics considered it reckless. Bomber commanders objected, crews feared heavier losses, and some fighter pilots questioned the wisdom of venturing so far from the formations they were meant to guard. By the summer of 1944, however, the results were undeniable. Aggressive sweeps over Germany, repeated raids on Berlin, and sustained pressure on industrial targets became feasible because enemy interceptors had been systematically reduced. In retrospect, military historians consistently identify the January 1944 change as the critical turning point in the air campaign over Europe. The principle that emerged, that offensive action offers stronger protection than passive defense, became foundational doctrine for modern air forces. Doolittle retired in 1946 after commanding major air forces in multiple theaters and receiving numerous honors, including the Medal of Honor. Yet he later described the fighter directive as his most consequential decision. It required accepting risk and confronting entrenched doctrine. In his view, air wars are not won by waiting to be attacked. They are won by taking the initiative and eliminating the opponent's ability to strike. The bombers ultimately returned in greater numbers, not because fighters stayed close at all times, but because the enemy's fighters had been hunted down and destroyed. In January 1944, a wall sign ordered removed by Jimmy Doolittle was taken down from a headquarters building. Today, that original sign is preserved at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton. Beside it hangs the replacement. Displayed together, they symbolize a decisive shift in American air strategy during the Second World War. At the time, many bomber crews strongly objected to Doolittle's new directive. They believed escort fighters should remain close to bomber formations at all times. To them, allowing fighters to range ahead in search of German aircraft felt like abandonment. Combat experience soon reversed that view. The most reliable way to safeguard bombers was not passive escort, it was the aggressive elimination of enemy interceptors before they could strike. For the Luftwaffe, this policy marked a turning point. As late as October 1943, German forces had been steadily wearing down Allied bomber streams in a costly war of attrition. Within 6 months of the January 1944 shift, however, the balance had collapsed. Overwhelmed by American production capacity, superior pilot training, improved aircraft performance, and bold offensive tactics, Germany's air arm ceased to function as an effective fighting force. The air campaign from January through June 1944 highlights enduring military principles. When opposing sides possess roughly comparable capabilities, the force that acts offensively often prevails over one that remains reactive. Well-trained personnel can outperform larger opponents, and when technological advantages are paired with tactical innovation, the result can be decisive dominance. To seek and engage German aircraft wherever found, he transformed the air battle over Europe. The bomber crews who once feared the change eventually credited it with increasing their survival rates. German pilots, for their part, confronted the consequences too late. The results were unmistakable by June 6, 1944. As Allied forces landed in Normandy during the D-Day, the skies above were largely free of German opposition. For 5 years, the Luftwaffe had dominated European airspace, crushing air forces from Poland to France and bombing London relentlessly. Now it was absent. Allied fighters had systematically hunted down its remaining strength. Air superiority was achieved not by focusing solely on factories or by clustering defensively around bomber formations, but by relentlessly targeting enemy aircraft. The order to remove that sign was issued on January 6, 1944. By early summer, German air power in Western Europe had been effectively shattered. The link between those moments is clear. A doctrinal adjustment, simple in wording yet bold in implication, reshaped the air war. History regards Doolittle's decision as one of the most consequential command choices of the conflict. Its power did not lie in technical complexity, but in strategic clarity. The essential mission of fighter aircraft is to eliminate opposing fighters. Once that principle guided operations, the outcome followed.